I'd like to welcome everyone back after lunch. Hope you had a good lunch. And maybe I'll just call roll to make sure our quorum is still here. So if you would say yes to when I call your name, I'd appreciate that. Holly Kaiser,
Here.
Ted Borges,
Yes.
Karen Chang,
Here.
Gilda Dominguez,
Yes.
Debbie Snow,
This is the moderator. Member Snow dropped off during the lunch break and has not yet returned. I'm watching for her, however.
Oh, okay. So I'm here, but we do need her, so we should wait until she comes on the call. Can anybody text her?
She is there.
Oh, good. Debbie, are you there?
Yes, sorry, my computer was having trouble letting me back in.
Okay,
That's what took me a while.
no problem. Glad to have you here. So we do have a quorum. I think we have to go back to item number 14. We covered essentially everything except for 14C. So I would like to pick up there and have Heather talk a little bit about this before we start our discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Heather Olivares, Legislation and Regulation Analyst. I'm here to present on a regulatory proposal regarding speech-language pathology assistant requirements. This regulatory proposal was approved in 2018, but was put on hold temporarily due to language that conflicted with the fee regulations. Now that the fee regulations have been approved, the board is able to move forward with this regulatory proposal. Board staff have received feedback from our legal counsel and have revised language for review and discussion. The changes being proposed are in colored print on the draft language that follows, and I will provide an overview of the major changes and be happy to answer any questions about some of the other changes as well as they come up. So the first major change is on page 1 of 16 of the proposed regulatory language, and that is to move the definition of immediate supervision to improve clarity for the regulated public that immediate supervision is the highest level of supervision and that indirect supervision is the lowest level of supervision. Then the second major change, also on page 2, is to clarify the difference between direct supervision and indirect supervision. Since they both allow supervision by electronic means, and so we are recommending differentiating by use of the terms that we all know so well these days, synchronous and asynchronous. And board staff also recommend clarifying that direct supervision must include both audio and visual observation, which is consistent with what the board decided in a separate regulatory proposal regarding RPE supervision requirements. So you'll see those changes on page 1. Then on pages 4 and 5, in sections 1399.170.4 and 1399.170.5. These should be amended to clarify the eligibility for Slipa training programs, followed by the application and approval requirement. Board staff has recommended changes by restructuring both of these sections. And then finally on page 11 and 12, and also in the responsibility statement form that is included in your materials, we are proposing for section 1399.170.15 to be amended to provide the requirements for Slipa supervisors and specifying on the form that must be provided to the board in order to supervise a Slipa. Board staff has recommended changes to this section and provided a copy of the proposed form. So before I go into proposed changes on the form, I wanted to ask if there's any questions on what is proposed in the language so far.
Heather, I was just wondering if there's any language in the changes that you discussed that have to do with supervisory requirements depending on the circumstances of the Slipa. That is it somebody who's only had 6 months experience versus somebody who's had 5 years of experience? As we discussed before, someone who plans to have a career as a Slipa as opposed to moving on to an SLP program. Is any of that kind of language in here?
So we actually have that laid out as a policy discussion item. And so we'll get down to that when we get into that section. We have a number of areas where we need the direction from the board and we don't have specific language already proposed. So they're for more lengthy discussion later on.
Okay.
But it seems like there might not be any questions on what I covered so far, so I can go over the recommended changes on the form. If you want to turn to the responsibility statement for supervisors of a speech-language pathology assistant. And the first change on page 1 is pretty simple, where you're just recommending asking for the clear credential license number rather than the issue date, because we actually use that number to verify with the CTC that they are in fact credentialed. And that's the useful information rather than the issue date. On page 2, we are recommending removing under penalty of perjury to not require that the document is signed under that. And that's based on a recommendation from our legal counsel. Also on page 2, DCA legal counsel has recommended against requiring a licensee to understand the laws and regulations, because there is not a way to ensure compliance that someone understands something. So we have proposed changes to say they have read the laws, and then for the supervisor that they have reviewed the laws. And then on page 2 at the bottom, there's a requirement regarding emergencies, and we are recommending that this language be consistent with the requirement in the regulation section 1399.170.15, which says, I will provide the assistant with a plan for handling emergencies. And then finally on page, highlighted on page 3 of the form, is providing a copy of the form to the assistant, and then not supervising more than 3 support personnel, not more than 2 of which hold the title of Slipa. And I've highlighted that just as in case we make any changes to the regulation language, that we do need to go back on this form and update that as well. So are there any questions about those recommended changes? Okay, it doesn't look like it. So the first for policy discussion is, you will see this on pages 2 and 4 of the proposed regulatory language. In section J, there's qualifications deemed equivalent by the board, which is proposed to mean a person who holds a current, active, and unrestricted license or has legal authorization to practice. We're suggesting that this needs to be clarified, and the standards the board will use to determine equivalency must be provided to the regulated community. And so I have a number of questions posed to the board. The first one is, are there concerns with who serves as a Slipa program director? If so, the board needs to specify if this is intended to refer only to those authorized to practice in California, such as individuals with a CTC credential, or if it also refers to individuals with a credential or license in another state. Also, a recommendation that the same standard of license status should apply to both California licensees and other licensees. And for enforcement purposes, board staff recommends using the term current, active, and unrestricted for the license status. And finally, they tend to apply to Slipa supervisors as well. So I'll open it up for discussion.
Would it help if we took those one at a time?
Sure, that's fine. We can start with, it seems like most of this language is directed at Slipa program directors, and our understanding is that for the school programs, they may often recruit program directors that are licensed in other states. And so I guess our first question is if there's even concerns with who a college program recommends or chooses to be their program director.
Holly has her hand up. I don't know if she wants to speak to that or something else.
It was something else. It was about the form. Should I still, it's a minor thing. Should I go ahead and bring it up?
Sure.
Okay. It was under Part B, number 2, where it stated speech language pathology license number or clear credential license number. So a credential, they don't call it a license number. They have a document number. So that's just a wording change there.
Okay, perfect. I'll go ahead and make that change.
All right, thank you.
So Heather, did you say that it's possible that a Slipa program could have a program director from another state
Correct.
because they have like franchised programs that are, nationwide? Is that how it's set up?
Well, we're talking about like the Slipa schools that are the Slipa programs that are at the community colleges.
That seems odd, though, that they would have somebody from another state. But I don't know anything about Slipa programs per se.
Is that basically just the concern of them recruiting for a program head and someone from Nevada applies and they end up hiring them. So has this become a reciprocity issue?
Well, see, that's our question to you guys. If you have a concern, who serves in that role?
So is that then the stipulation might be if we had an issue that there would have to be something written in that they would have to be licensed in California or have a California license in order to work in that position?
Yeah, if that's the direction the board wants to go, then we would get rid of this definition of qualifications deemed equivalent by the board, because the requirement would be being licensed in California. There wouldn't be an equivalency to that.
Or we have to come up with what the equivalency is.
Correct.
I'm just a little old hearing aid dispenser, but I'm trying to facilitate.
And if we want to go directly to hearing from the public, that's okay too. If there are people here who do serve in that role already and can speak to it, that would be helpful as well.
Holly, did you have something else you wanted to say though?
Well, I would think if somebody is the director of a program in California, that they certainly would be knowledgeable and accountable to all requirements in California. So to me, it would make sense that they would have that that license, even if they're living in another state. Just like in telepractice, you have to have a license for the state you're practicing in. So I would think that would be important.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment, but do we want to go to public comment at this point to see if there's any expertise out there who could has an opinion about it?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, why don't we do that, moderator?
This is the moderator who votes the Q&A panel. If anyone would like to make a comment on this item, please click on the Q&A icon on your screen, type comment into the text field, and submit that to all panelists. Our first comment comes from Linda Pippert. Linda, I've sent you a request to unmute your microphone. And as a reminder, you'll have 3 minutes.
Yeah, this is Linda Pippert. I'm a speech language pathologist in California. I pretty much know all of the program directors, I think, for the SLPA programs at community colleges in California, except for the one at Reedley College. And all of them are locally grown California professionals. And I can't imagine that we would want someone running an SLPA program, training program in California that wasn't licensed themselves here. I know there used to be an Oregon program, but I don't see it listed on your website anymore. So that's just my comment. Thank you.
Any other public member who has a comment about this? It doesn't look like it at this time. Is it
I'm not seeing any other requests right now.
Can we leave it open so we could go back and forth between the board?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So Holly, is your hand still up or is this a new hand raise?
It's not.
Okay, then Todd?
So then I have a question. So if we have an open position, if the college has an open position for this person and they can't find anyone to run the position, then what happens if they, have to go farther afield to find someone? Just throwing it out there. I don't necessarily have an opinion one way or the other at this stage concerning this, but just kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit. What would they then do? Is this going to create a potential issue for that college if they can't go a little bit farther afield?
I believe they could still recruit outside of the state, but then that person would they'd obviously have to hold a license in another state and then apply to get licensure in our state. And if they have their ASHA Cs, it's relatively easy to use that to get licensed in our state as well.
Okay, so there's not a terrific barrier to get licensed in California.
Yeah, so far we have a process for people licensed out of state, and then there's an even abbreviated process for people who have their ASHA Cs to become licensed in the state.
Can I comment on that, Dr. Rajo?
Of course.
Yeah, I do want to point out though that it could delay the process if the person didn't meet the criteria that Heather just described. And I know that we've had similar issues with other types of programs where the program wanted to hire someone licensed in California. They came from out of state, and there was the licensing process. So it did create some delays. I think, Dr. Rajo, you're familiar with situations like this that we've experienced.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it looks like Linda Pippert might have a comment as well.
Yeah, this is Linda Pippert again. Thank you so much for addressing this issue. I can't imagine that any of the universities would want to hire someone that didn't have their ASHA Cs, even if they did a nationwide search for someone for their program. Number one. Number two is we have so many qualified people that would be able to run an SLPA training program here in California, that the people I see on this list, some of them I've known them from graduate school, known them 25 years or more. They're basically California people. So I appreciate the concern, but certainly as a practitioner in the state and having familiarity with the SLPA programs, it certainly doesn't concern me. Thank you.
Okay, so it looks like the consensus I'm hearing is that we want somebody to be California licensed to supervise a Slipa program or to manage a program. Is that a fair statement? Gilda?
Yes, that's absolutely a fair statement. I do agree. I think that would be the best case scenario.
So in that case, Heather, do we have to, is that a change to the regulatory language to remove that F or J, excuse me, J aspect of this?
At this point, we would definitely on page 4 in 1399.170.4 subdivision B, it would state, to be eligible for approval by the board, the program director must hold a current, active, and unrestricted license, period. So we would get rid of the qualifications deemed equivalent by the board. We likely will remove it from J on page 2 as well, but some of our other questions were regarding if we would like Slipa supervisors to have other qualifications deemed equivalent by the board, or if we would not make any changes to that at this time.
Should this 1399.174.4b say California? California, a current active and unrestricted California license?
We can specify that, yeah. I believe it's kind of implied, but if we want to make it super clear, I will go ahead and do that.
And so we're also trying to decide if we're okay with the phrase "or have qualifications deemed equivalent by the board."
Yes, in regards to who can be a supervisor for Slipa. Currently, we allow those with a CTC credential to serve as supervisors for Slipas, as well as California licensees. So if we want to stay with that, I believe we can get rid of the definition of qualifications deemed equivalent by the board.
I'm sorry, I guess I'm confused. I thought we were talking about a program director, not a supervisor. So this is two different places.
Yes. It's just for discussion if we wanted to make any changes, but if we want to stay with how we currently are operating, then I believe we can get rid of that definition.
Gilda? Did you have your hand up?
No, sorry about that.
Okay. Okay, so I'm sorry, Heather, so we're going to stick with the way it's listed now, except for adding the word California?
Yeah, correct. With the changes that I already said of getting rid of the qualifications deemed equivalent by the board on page 4. And then it sounds like we don't want to make any other changes to who can supervise a Slipa. So we will take out the on page 2, subsection J, the qualifications deemed equivalent by the board. That definition that we have there, I'll just take all of that out.
Okay.
So I think that covers policy discussion item number 1. Number 2, this comment is referring to language on pages 3 and 11 of the proposed language. And the board previously approved regulatory language requiring a Slipa to be supervised 20% of the time during the first 90 days. If the board wishes to keep this requirement, it needs to be clarified. Specifically, should the same standard apply to both seasoned and newly licensed Slipas? And if the standard is different, how many years of experience would be considered seasoned? And then also, how should Slipas with multiple supervisors be handled? And just a little bit more on that point. Especially in schools, what we see is a Slipa may be working at multiple school sites and perhaps work at one school site on Monday and Wednesday and another on Tuesday and Thursday. And based on which school they're at, it depends who their SLP supervisor is at that site. So if we are keeping this requirement of 20% supervision for the first 90 days, how would that be handled when they have 2 separate supervisors or 3 supervisors?
Would it seem logical that it would be the same percentage regardless of the number of supervisors?
That's for, I guess it would be, do we need to specify that each supervisor needs to supervise them 20% of the time that they are being the supervisor for the Slipa, or would it be that just one of the supervisors needs to meet that 20% requirement? It's how specific do we want to get, and we do need to make it clear in our regulation what the standard is.
Well, since it's stipulated that it's the first 90 days, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask that all supervisors supervise for 20%. But I defer to the speech pathologist on the board. Holly?
Yes, I think anybody that is supervising an SLPA needs to be directly responsible. Well, it's not that I think, they're directly responsible for that, whatever that person is doing. So it can't be left up to the reporting to just be one SLP if the SLPA works for, is working with other SLPs. So I like your idea, Marcia, if that would work out, that it's 20% of whatever that SLPA's time, employment or time is. So you keep that same ratio. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And this would be true, and I don't know if we need stipulated language that says whether it's a newly minted SLPA or an older experienced SLPA, they would still both function on the same 20% supervision the first 90 days. Is that your sense too? Gilda has her hand up.
Yes, so I wanted to respond back to the 20%. So the proposed, maybe I misunderstood you, Holly. So if they have two supervisors, each supervisor is going to be required to supervise the SLP's time for 20% of their work week. So versus if they just work their week, it is up to each supervisor to collaborate with one another and strategize how they're going to get the 20% total for that week. Can we clarify that?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more comment about this. My thought is that you need to have that direct contact with your SLPA regarding the work they're doing on your caseload. So I think that it would need to be any person that is responsible as a supervisor needs to have that direct responsibility for whatever piece of work that SLPA is doing, even if it's only one day a week, versus collaborating and having one lead SLP be responsible. That's my thought about it.
Okay, thank you.
Does that clarify?
Yes,
okay.
thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Todd, did you have a question or comment?
Well, actually, I think Holly addressed it because my question was, what's more important, that 20% of their work week is supervised? No matter who's doing the supervision, 20% of their hours, however many that is supervised, or is it more important that each supervisor lends 20% of their time to supervise that person? What are we getting at in the end? Just that they're covered for 20% of their work week, or we want to make sure that each supervisor takes 20% of their time so they're equally responsible for that person?
I didn't think of it that way. I thought it meant 20% of the work of the Slipa, of the work time.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
that's what I meant. Yeah.
Right. But then when we start parsing it with, well, each supervisor has to make sure 20% of their time is given to the person, then suddenly it kind of, the math kind of changes a little bit.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm sorry. Yeah, that is not what I meant. I meant what Marcia was saying. It's 20% of whatever that SLPA's allotted work, caseload is, the time that they're working.
Gotcha. Because I mean,
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. You'd alluded to making sure that one of the supervisors isn't spending most of their time with that one person. So I wanted to make sure I was clear, what our ultimate goal was with this.
Okay, Debbie Snow?
I just wanted to mention that my internet lost access and I was kicked off for about 10 minutes and I'm back on.
It's on computers. Well, glad to have you back on. Gilda, did you have another comment?
Yes, I think we're still going back and forth on the 20%. So is it that each supervisor is expected to lend 20% of their time? Or is it combined between the two supervisors to provide 20% per week of supervision?
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
So, like I'm going to use the wording in ASHA, which may also actually be in the regulations, but I just have this in front of me. And well, except we have 20%, a total of at least, let's say 20% direct and 20% supervision. It should be no less than 20% of the actual student, patient, and client contact time weekly for each SLPA. I just like the wording. It explains better, that I wasn't able to explain it very well myself. So it's related directly to how much work that SLPA is doing. So 20% of their work, each SLPA is supervised by their supervisor for that work.
I think the language is pretty clear. It says shall provide immediate supervision of all duties performed at least 20% per week. That they're talking about the supervision time, not the time of the supervisor. But if there's confusion in the language, I don't know, should we alter this somehow to make it clearer?
Do we just put in 20% of the SLPA's time? Actually identify whose 20% that is? Would that make it more clear from a legal standpoint?
Gilda, do you have a thought about that?
Yes, I do. I think that would add some clarity. I guess where I was getting, it's very clear on paper to me, but where I was getting confused is that when we started talking about each supervisor supervising 20%, but I think combined, it should just be 20% of the SLPA's work week. However, that is configured by one or two supervisors, needs to be documented as it had been strategized.
Okay, I didn't think that's what it was saying either, that
Yeah, exactly,
it was
right?
combined 20%.
Right.
The work that they do under each supervisor should be supervised 20%. That's how I read that.
Yes, me too. Thank you.
So not a combined
read it.
20%, but 20% for each one.
Oh, for each.
But let's keep talking about here. Karen Chang.
I'm also thinking 20% for each one, because if you think, why are we having this 20% supervision anyways, is to make sure that consumers are protected. So say they get 20% that week of just one supervisor, and then they go someplace else and they get zero supervision, then those consumers that have zero supervision may not be protected. So my thought was this regulation was for each supervisor would do 20%. And I haven't calculated mathematically, but say you do 40 hours and you do 20 hours for one and 20 hours for another one, then it still comes out the same amount of hours of supervision for the SLPA, right?
Yeah, that's what I
Well,
thought.
actually, the numbers come out a little bit differently, because if I'm working a 40-hour week, 20% of 40 hours is 8. So if I have one supervisor on Monday and Tuesday and a different supervisor on Wednesday and Thursday, then theoretically I'd be getting 20% from both of them, which would actually be 16 of my 40 hours, which I'm not necessarily saying that's good, bad, or indifferent. We're talking about two completely different sets of numbers, between 20% of my 40-hour work week or 20% of three other people, which actually could be more than 20% of my 40-hour work week is supervised. So they're two very different formulas. So I think we need to decide on how many hours we think they should be supervised and work back from that. If we're saying they should be supervised 20% of their time, that's a whole other different thing. Does that make sense?
I'm not quite following that. I was kind of following what Karen Chang said, that we can't predict, how many hours as a SIPA might work in the environment with a given supervisor. So to say 20% per supervisor for that particular SLIPA would be appropriate, especially since it's only for 90 days. Linda's had her hand up for a long time. Can I ask for a public comment on that?
Yeah.
Thank you, Marcia. This is Linda Pippert, again, speech language pathologist. I do appreciate that you're wrestling with the verbiage on this, because I will tell you there's a lot of confusion out in the community about this change. People are saying, well, does it mean that they need 90 days of 20% supervision as a new SLPA? Does it mean they need 20% supervision for 90 days if they get a new job? Does it mean 20% supervision for 90 days if they get a new supervisor? So these are the questions that I have heard over the last few years while we've been working through this. So to define those things is really, really important. So I appreciate you doing that.
Okay, thank you. Heather?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Mr. Borges's comment about defining what the number of hours are. The challenge is that SLIPAs often work part-time, especially in school sites. So if you define that it's, let's say, 10 hours per week of supervision, that may end up being more than half for a certain SLIPA. So I think going with a percentage, and whatever the percentage is, I think the percentage is what would work better, since we do have SLIPAs in multiple sites.
You mean the percentage per supervisor as opposed to percentage of hours worked?
Not so much providing which the policy of the board should be in that regard, but saying it's a percentage rather than we are requiring 8 hours per week of supervision. It should be a percentage
Right.
of their total week.
Karen Chang?
I'm reading this as hours work because it says 20% per week of the work schedule, which in my mind, it's reading hours work for that week. So, say they have three different supervisors, each supervisor will do that 20%.
That's how I would interpret it, especially as a consumer protection issue. The only punitive thing would be what Linda suggested, and that is if you get a new supervisor. You wouldn't expect the SLPA to have to be supervised again just because the supervisor changes.
No. I think it depends on, say they work at a school district, they've worked at that school district for 90 days, they could change supervisors 5 times, but in that same school district, right? And every week, they might have a new supervisor, but as long as it's 20% a supervisor, any supervisor would.
And it can't be the supervisor's time, because if they had 3 supervisees, they could end up spending 60% of their time supervising direct supervision, and maybe that's not realistic.
No, it would be like, it wouldn't be like one person with 2 supervisors and they would have to do 20/20, so that's 40%. No, it would just be 20%, like just one school. If you're in a school district, just one place, and just have some type of supervision 20% of the time.
Yeah. Are we all on the same page about that at this point? Let's see. Heather Oliveris?
So are we back to it being, let's say they work 30 hours, they are 20% of those 30 hours, but not specifying which supervisor it is, leaving that discretion? Is that where you guys are back at?
How realistic is it that, if I can ask the speech pathology board members, for one Slipa to have multiple supervisors in the same location? Is that common?
Let's see. Hi, it's Holly. I believe, I don't know how common it is. I might need public comment for that. I know in talking to some folks when, especially with compensatory hours being made up at this point, you may have a large influx of students that need to be seen in one school site, and you could have multiple SLPAs assigned, for a period of time. I mean, that would be one example. And I still was thinking whoever is directly responsible as their SLP would be responsible for whatever their workload is. If it's 2 days a week or 3 days or whatever, that 20% of supervision would go back to that specific SLP, because they're the ones that know that caseload. If there's 3 different SLPAs working, or right now only 2 can be working under that SLP, that's not presenting a problem because you have one SLP being responsible. But when you have multiple SLPs, then again, I think it goes back to each of them being responsible for 20% of their SLPA that they're supervising.
Okay, so it sounds like there's at least, if there's more than one SLP, that there's going to be a lead assigned supervisor for any given SLPA. And we could assign that 20% to that person, or the school would. Is that right?
We currently have on our form that they have to fill out, one does have to be the primary supervisor for the purposes of assisting the Slipa in compliance with their continuing education. So we could add on to that lead supervisor is also responsible for determining how the Slipa is going to be getting their 20% supervision.
Okay, so do you think we need to make any kind of change to, let's see, 1399.170.2D, 3D, to include that language that Todd was suggesting, that it's 20% of the Slipa's work time as opposed to the supervisor's time?
Yeah, so we would just add 20% per week of the Slipa's work schedule.
Yes, that sounds good to me. We all agree.
And then we
Yes.
might want to add a second sentence that says the lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring that the Slipa receives their 20% supervision or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everyone okay with that notion? Adding that additional sentence and adding SLP work schedule?
Yes.
Roger, I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Looks like Karen Halbo has her hand up.
I was just going to suggest for Heather, the lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring the Slipa meets the requirements of this subdivision or paragraph or subsection. That way
Perfect.
it's a little clearer.
Okay, Paul, did you want to say something?
Yes, and I had a similar concern to what Karen brought up, but I also wanted to ask Heather if she could point us to the section on the form that talks about lead supervisor. Is that in our packet? Is that the responsibility?
Yeah, that's on page 1 at the bottom of the form. question number 6.
Got
It
it. Okay.
says, yeah. So we will want to go back and look at this section 1399.170.17. And also, and that's regarding multiple supervision, we'll also want to add there that the lead supervisor, and let me read to you the language I just wrote down from Karen. I said, the lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring the Slipa meets the requirement in this subdivision. So I would take that same language and add it in 1399.170.17 that says the the lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring the Slipa meets the supervision requirements in section 1399.1702 subdivision D. So it's tying it, both of those together.
Thank you. That addresses my concern. I was looking at this from an enforcement standpoint, wanting to make sure that it's enforceable.
And let me just write it all down. Give me a minute so I make sure I have it. And then the other place we will need to make a change is on page 11, where we lay out the requirements for the supervision of a Slipa. And on the bottom of it in number 4, we have provide immediate supervision at least 20% per week of the work schedule for the first 90 days. We will want to add that same sentence about the lead supervisor being responsible for ensuring that happens. So that's all the changes that need to be made to the language for this one.
Do we need to add that same qualification that it's the Slipa's work schedule?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so that covers number 2. The next item for policy discussion is it's regarding the form on page 3. We state that the form a copy of that form needs to be provided to the Slipa. Are there concerns that a Slipa would not be provided a copy of this form? Board staff consider this to be more of an employment issue rather than an enforcement issue from the board. So we want to discuss if we should not even speak to that requirement in our regs, or if there is a concern that a Slipa wouldn't be provided a copy, and we do need to keep that in our regs.
I'm sorry, what page was that? You said 30?
It's page 3 of the form, and then also on page 12 of the regulatory text. And that is on
3?
kind of in the middle of page 12, where it's the number 1. It says the supervisor shall provide a copy of the form to the assistant within 45 days from the commencement date of supervision.
So I'm sorry, were you saying that we might remove that and not say anything about it?
Yeah, board staff is recommending it be removed as it's more of an employment issue that we wouldn't really get involved in enforcement of that.
Well, what consequence does it have for us if they don't? If they don't provide that copy in 45 days?
I believe that if we received a complaint, we would have to investigate the complaint as through our formal enforcement process.
I mean, do you not consider that an important benchmark for the supervisory tract?
Hi, Heather. This is Paul. I think that's what we're trying to determine, right? I mean, we know that if it was a violation, it could be part of an investigation, be considered a violation, citable violation.
Then
So I think we're trying to figure out if this is important enough to have in the regulation.
Does it hurt to keep it there? Because I mean, if it's in black and white, then there's little wiggle room for somebody who violates it. But if you take it out, then it's the, I never saw the rules excuse.
Looks like we might have a question from someone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Heather, or I see Linda's going to respond, or hopefully. Linda Pipper.
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, I was still concerned about the last point, but this one going in, I think it would matter to some people more than others. I see a lot. I get SLPs contacting me. I've got supervisors. They'll say, I've got supervisors on my license that never sent in the termination form. And they weren't my supervisor for the last 45 days or 2 years or all these different landmarks. And I don't know that there's anything punishable done to them, except I say, well, contact the supervisor and have them do the termination form. So I think to have that in there gives maybe some leverage for the SLPAs, because I think if it's not in writing, they sometimes feel, in my opinion anyway, they get a bit intimidated about going back and asking a supervisor for something that's not spelled out clearly. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you, Linda, for that. That does make sense as a place where a Slipa can point to in the regulations, that it's not as scary to say to a supervisor, hey, you need to meet this requirement, and here it is right in the regulation.
So is the consensus that we're feeling like we should just leave that language in as is? Gilda?
I agree. I think it should be left in. That's the support, documentation, and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Anyone who feels otherwise?
This is Charisse. Just so that we are clear then, would it potentially be useful to add a similar requirement in section 1399.170.18 on the notice of termination? Because it sounds like that's also a big concern, that they're not turning in the notice of termination on time and they're not providing them a copy, so there's no way for them to circle back.
Kind of
Is that
sounds like
also?
Yeah, I'm curious why it's not there already.
I would think so. Keep it.
The original shall be submitted to the board. 14 days. Well, it does already say 14 days.
But that's to be
for
submitted to us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to them, to the.
So it sounds like maybe adding consistent language that the supervisor should provide a copy of the form to the assistant within 45 business days.
Yeah.
So we're consistent.
Mhm.
Okay, so it sounds like we have addressed item number 3. The next one is in relation to a comment on page 13 of the text. And this is regarding the number of support personnel that a SLP can supervise. I did listen into the conversation at the committee level yesterday, and it seemed like at this time there wasn't a formal recommendation of changing that, but I do have that as an open item since we are already working on these regulations anyways, if we do want to move forward with making any changes. Otherwise, it'll stay as is right now.
Okay, let's look at that.
Okay, Charisse, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so this is Charisse. As promised yesterday, I have gone ahead and pulled up the occupational therapy assistant and physical therapy assistant requirements. The Board of Occupational Therapy requirement is actually in statute. It's Business and Professions Code Section 2570.3, Subdivision J. It states that an occupational therapist shall not supervise more occupational therapy assistants at any one time than can be appropriately supervised in the opinion of the board. 3 occupational therapy assistants shall be the maximum number of occupational therapy assistants supervised by an occupational therapist at any one time, but the board may permit the supervision of a greater number by an occupational therapist if, in the opinion of the board, there would be adequate supervision and the public's health and safety would be served. In no case shall the total number of occupational therapy assistants exceed twice the number of occupational therapists regularly employed by the facility at one time. When we go to the physical therapy board, their requirement is also in statute. It's in Business and Professions Code Section 2622. And it's a subdivision B of that statute, and it says a physical therapist shall not supervise more than 2 physical therapy assistants at one time to assist the physical therapist in his or her practice of physical therapy. So what I will mention is that the occupational therapy language is somewhat similar to our RPE language, our required professional experience temporary license language, so that you can get approved for more RPEs under your license if after the board has reviewed it, we believe that it's continues to protect the public's health and safety, and oftentimes that is approved because the supervisor, the sole responsibility is supervision, so they don't have their own caseload.
Right.
So that's kind of there, although they do have that little not to exceed twice the number of therapists employed at the same facility. We don't have that language, but that lets us know that essentially they're saying there is still a maximum. There's not an unlimited. So if we were going to say it's 3 or the part-time equivalent, then there's no more than 6 or something like that. If we were to determine that 2 part-time equivalent or 2 part-time Slipas equals 1 full-time equivalent Slipa. So those are kind of the opportunities there, but I did want to make sure we knew 3 is occupational therapy and physical therapy is 2. And of course, occupational therapy has some wiggle room to go up if your primary job is only supervision, or you have a lower caseload and it's mostly supervision. So that is something to consider if we do want to make a decision at this time.
It looks like Linda Pippert would like to say something.
Thank you, Marcia. PT and OT do have this in their regulations of no more than a certain number of PT assistants for a PT or OTAs for an occupational therapist. What they don't have is they don't have them tied to their licenses. So they have the flexibility that when I was a rehab manager and had an OT on staff, I could have 2 occupational therapy assistants working with her during the day. But if one of them's sick and somebody else comes in, I can have another occupational therapist come and work with them. So there's no registration tying the OT and the OTA or the PT and the PTA. There's just a lot more flexibility in the staffing part of it. Thank you.
Gilda?
I recall the discussion of accommodating part-time Slipas, and how can we accommodate the I guess the flexibility of the supervision by the SLPs to supervise per se, like 2 part-time FTEs, and can there be a consideration of having a maximum of the number of support personnel as well? Can that be blended?
I mean, that's always an option, is to have something similar where there's a maximum statement as well that goes in there. So it's 3 support personnel, full-time support personnel, or their part-time equivalent, not to exceed blank.
4, okay.
So that is an option as well, to have language in some version of that. None of that would change the tethering to a license that Ms. Pippert had mentioned, of course.
Right, and you know, as I would think 6 would be a hypothetical number, right? I think 6 would be a lot if we're looking at, okay, how many part-timers, how many full-timers, but you know, maybe we cap that out at 4, and two can be Slipas, and the other 2 can be the aides. Just as an example, where you have a max of 4, and those maybe those Slipas are full-time and those aides are 2 aides are part-time.
Do we have a lot of use of aides in the community? That's the one part I wasn't completely sure about. And if that flexibility to have just the 3 being all Slipas or their part-time equivalents. That's one thing I wasn't sure about personally.
I think
This is Lisa Snelling, a licensing analyst. We see very, very few speech aid applications. I would say it's less than 2 or 3 per year.
So my question about that is, we had talked about this yesterday, taking out the language about not more than 2 of which hold the title of SLPA. If we use the term support personnel, will that automatically include SLPAs and aides in case they are used?
Yes, as long as you keep the sentence that says support personnel includes a speech language pathology assistant and speech language pathology aide.
Keep that in the definition. Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of your choice to mix and match, but it's just the 3 or just the 4 or just the whatever with the part-time equivalent, but no more than blank.
Gilda, did you have your hand up again?
Sure, yes. And I guess for discussion too, so what would be that maximum that would be supporting our consumers and also being able to manage the caseload in a specific work environment? You know, is that 4? Is that 5? Is that 3 SLPAs? You know, because I know that if we have, there is a conversation, okay, so if there's 2, that still limits us. So I'm thinking that people want to be able to supervise more than 2 SLPAs. Maybe during public comment that could be asked as well, but how many are they hearing that SLPs are wanting to supervise in order to adequately manage their caseload?
Linda? Linda, do you have your hand up, or
Yeah.
do you want to address that or
Yes.
something else?
Yeah, this is Linda Pippert again. Aids, just to go back to clarify, aids are rarely used because they're not billable and they have to be 100% immediately supervised if they're with clients. So it's kind of like a moot point. I frankly don't know anyone using a speech aid that's registered with your licensing board. And I know people working all over the entire state. So yeah, that it's very rare. So I wasn't surprised when the staff said, no, we only get a couple applications every year. People would be delighted if they were able to have more than 2 SLPAs. And I so appreciated Gilda's comments yesterday, so thoughtful about FTEs, because that really is the issue. And I think it's come up in today's conversation and yesterday's extensively, is so many of the speech language pathology assistants work part-time. They maybe have a 20% job and a 40% job that they put together to make their career and make for a decent income. And it gives latitude in serving more of our clients. So we certainly appreciate that they're willing to do these different kinds of activities. But I know private practitioners have told me, certainly Michelle Linares yesterday and others here in Orange County where I live, that to have the flexibility to have someone counted as a part-timer rather than a full-time person, if there were 3 full-time equivalencies and they could supervise up to 5 SLPAs, I think the community would be absolutely delighted, because from, again, your board standpoint, they would be able to serve that many more clients in the community. Thank you.
Could 3 full-time equivalent be 6 people?
It could.
Yes, depending on how we define, hi, this is Paul. Depending on how we define the full-time equivalents. But I also like what Linda Pippert had to say, because it actually keeps within the spirit of the original regulation and balancing consumer protection with the needs that are out there.
What if we didn't use stipulated a certain number, but rather had a ceiling only? Would that serve?
Like up to 3 full-time equivalent staff. Is that what you're saying?
Something like that.
I think that we have to just be careful and define what full-time equivalent means.
Holly?
Well, first of all, thank you, Linda, for putting kind of a stake in the ground with this conversation. And I also agree about, that, as Gilda said, with the FTE equivalent. One of the comments yesterday from Michelle was that, there's a lot of folks that work over 20 hours a week and they're still considered part-time. They don't get benefits until they reach usually 30 hours. So I guess I'm also wondering about, when we look at the part-time, the full-time equivalent, how do you count a a part-time person up to 29 hours or 20 hours weeks or that kind of thing? Do we need to spell that out as well?
I would think we do that, because you could have a lot of people working 15% time and end up supervising way more people than you should be for consumer protection purposes. Let's see, Linda, you want
This
to
is Heather.
Okay. Heather?
From a regulatory standpoint, we should definitely make it as clear as possible what the limit is of the number of hours per week that can be considered part-time.
Linda,
This is
did you-
Charisse.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
Put your hand up.
I didn't.
Okay, Linda does have her hand up.
Thank you, Marcia. You do have on your applications for RPEs very clearly spelled out that up to 29 hours a week is considered part-time, and then 30 to 40 is considered full-time. So you do have something in your regulations about that already if you wanted to think that that was appropriate and move it over to this model as well. Thank you.
Charisse?
I was just going to suggest that normally boards like ours stay out of employment law and those kind of things, but we do have what we consider part-time versus full-time in RPE, so that is something that's available. But normally we don't try to restrict what somebody can classify them as. So just struggling with which way you go, but I'm not as certain that we needed the clarification right there, but I will bow to the will of the board there.
If there's so few audiology aids, do we even need to limit the number of Slipas? I mean, not that they can have an unlimited number, but at least give them another one.
I think part of the conversation yesterday, Dr. Raggio, was that we could just remove that part of the sentence that says not more than 2 of which hold the title of speech language pathology assistant. So then the reg would just say a supervisor can only have this number of support personnel. It sounds like we might add a maximum number in there, and then just point out what support personnel means. And then it's up to the SLP to mix and match how many of which. All Slipas, maybe an aid, who knows?
So to have a maximum, we're going to have to enter something about full-time equivalents into this statement. Is that right?
Yes, and I think the idea might be to put a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time support personnel, and then there can be discussion of defining the equivalent or not, or saying that there's a maximum.
I'd like to defer to the speech pathology. There are speech pathologists among us here to get your take on what Charisse just suggested. Gilda?
Yes, I think yes, maximum. So what Linda had mentioned, the community would be happy with, like you said, 5 SLPAs. So maybe we can put a maximum of 5 support personnel, and then include the language of which 3 may be full-time, or something to that effect, where you're addressing the full-time versus part-time status within that number. And we've already have the definitions, the operational definitions for full-time versus part-time on another document for RPEs.
Holly?
Yes, I would think that again, you want to keep in the wording full-time equivalent. So I think you would say up to, I was going to suggest 6, because I could see having, several people that are part-time, but up to 6 SLPAs, and not to exceed 3 full-time equivalent.
I'm wondering if it might be helpful to kind of keep some of the language similar, but a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time equivalent support personnel with a maximum of blank 5 or 6, your choice. Delete not more than 2 of which hold this title of speech language pathology assistant. So delete that last half of that one and instead have the maximum of. And then just leave the other sentence alone with support personnel includes speech language pathology assistants and speech language pathology aides.
That sounds cleaner to me.
Yeah, me too.
And would you like not to exceed as the language or a maximum of?
Yeah, the kind of equivalent statements, but not to exceed is probably the better language.
Okay.
Can you read that back to us once you get it?
Absolutely. Give me just a second. So a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time support personnel, comma, not to exceed 6 support personnel, period. Support personnel includes speech language pathology assistants and speech language pathology aides.
Do we have to say anything about timing, like at any one time or something like that?
It logistically works out normally that they can't add them. We put in system limitations so they can't add more, but I can actually see your point because of some of the creativity we have seen in the field, which we caught on to and said, no, that's not a thing. So if you would like that, and I think that's a wonderful addition, I think it should follow the 6. So a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time support personnel. And I don't know if you want at any point in time or at one point in, like, what's your preference on that?
At any point in time. Were you going to say FTE though?
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed it. My little arrow. A supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time support personnel at any point in time. Or any one point in time?
At any point in time. But were you going to say full-time equivalent and not just full-time support personnel?
Yes. I missed the equivalent. Apologies.
So maybe or its full-time equivalent.
Okay. That's fine. That sounds good.
Okay, so let me try that one then. So a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 support personnel or the full-time equivalent at any time. So that got awkward then. Comma, not to exceed 6 support personnel. I'm at that point then I'm going to put it at the end just grammatically. And so let me try this again. So a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time equivalent support personnel, comma, not to exceed 6 support personnel, comma, at any time.
Sounds good.
Gilda and Holly, does that sound okay?
Yes,
Or
it
would anybody
does.
like me to read it
Yeah,
again?
I just wanted to ask, so we could have 6 support personnel and they can also have an RPE as well. Is that manageable?
In these types of situations, when they're asking for more, they usually are writing us a letter. And so we actually have how many of each are on them. And so it's up to the staff to consider the public safety of having that maximum number, and then also asking the question of is there any workload that they're performing themselves, or if they're, because we do see some that are in programs where their role as an SLP is just as a supervisor of RPE. So we see that on the RPE side.
Right.
This is Paul. Hello, this is Paul. I want to make sure that do we need to make a statement of what support personnel is in that paragraph?
Oh, I left it in. The support personnel includes speech language pathology
Okay.
assistants and speech language pathology aides.
Okay.
Would it be good for me to read the whole thing over again?
Sure, couldn't hurt.
Okay. So for 1399.170.16, it would read, a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time equivalent support personnel, comma, not to exceed 6 support personnel, comma, at any time, period. Support personnel includes speech language pathology assistants and speech language pathology aides.
I think that sounds good. Seems to capture what we've been talking about. Any disagreement with that or any other thoughts? Okay, seeing none. Heather, are there more policy discussion issues you want to cover?
No, that is it. I just want to point out on the form on page 3, we will also need to change item number 13 to reflect the same language. And I think it'd probably be a good idea to go back through, starting on page 1. Well, actually, our first change would be on page 2, but to go back through the entire regulatory language and just make sure everyone is on the same page of the changes that we made before we move to a motion.
Okay, Holly has a comment though.
Yes, I thought we were also going to cover the supervision for SLPAs that are already experienced, and whether we need to make any kind of change regarding that. The ones that are career SLPAs. So, are we going to talk about that?
It seemed from the discussion we had earlier that there wasn't a desire to distinguish between seasoned and non-seasoned. But we can definitely go back to that if there is will of the board to make changes to the 90-day supervision rule.
It's kind of difficult to define seasoned. I can imagine people defining it differently. Let's see, Paul?
Yes, I think we have to be really careful there because we have a type of license, and it almost seems like we're creating another type of license here, kind of like a super Slipa. And, I think those definite, again, going back to what I know legal counsel would tell us is if you're going to make these kinds of changes, we're talking about legislative changes.
Looks like we have a public comment at this point. Michelle?
So Michelle, this is the moderator. I do not see that you have an audio connection. If you'd like to alternatively type your comment into the Q&A section, you can do that unless you'd like to check your microphone and speaker settings and see if you can get that connection. In the meantime, Linda has her hand raised. Would you like me to move on to her?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
My screen is short, so I don't see everybody.
It's okay. Actually, Michelle looks like she just connected. Let me try her.
Okay.
Michelle, I've sent you a request. There you go. And Michelle, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you. If you connected with both your phone and computer, you will have to unmute both of them.
Maybe we could get Linda's comment while we're waiting for Michelle to get hooked up.
Will do.
Thank you. I think this goes back to my comment earlier about the confusion under that Part D of 1399170 Part D, that people don't know what that first 90 days is. Is it a new SLPA in their first 90 days? Is it 90 days of a new job or 90 days with a new supervisor? So how you define first 90 days impacts if it's a seasoned, experienced SLPA versus someone that just finished their SLPA program, you know, a few weeks ago and just got their license. Thank you.
I interpreted that to mean 90 days of from first employment. Did somebody have a different thought about that? Not with a new supervisor. We just said no to that.
Dr. Rajo, this is Paul. By that, do you mean the first 90 days of licensure?
Is that when they begin? If that's when they begin, it's when they start the job, when they actually start doing the work. And I guess if they can't start work without licensure, then that is true.
Yeah, so I think we're talking about the first 90 days after being initially licensed. We're not talking about someone that has 15 years experience and is going into a new job, right?
So would that take care of it then if we said 90 days of first licensure, then the seasoned person wouldn't get caught in that need for supervision. Is that right?
Yes, I'd want to confirm with the board members that that's a desire.
Holly, do you still have your hand up, or is that a new hand? No. Okay.
I'm not sure if that was. Yeah, sorry.
Karen Chang.
Let Karen talk.
Yeah, I interpret it as 90 days once you start your new job, because you're not going to have a supervisor if you don't have a job yet, right?
Right. But I think Paul's point is a good one in that if it's 90 days from first licensure, then the seasoned people don't get caught in that. They don't need supervision, which is somebody else's point.
Oh.
Holly?
Well, yeah, I mean, they will always need supervision, but that's inherent in what an SLPA's definition is. You know, they're assistant to an SLP. So they will have that supervision even after the first 90 days. The first 90 days is, again, because they're new. That's the way I interpret it, but I think it has to be clarified. And after that, that's upon, you know, their requirements to be supervised in any job setting they're in.
Oh, I see. Did we ever get Michelle on?
Michelle, I show that you are unmuted. Can we check your microphone again? We are still not hearing you, and I'm unsure if you can hear us. She muted herself. Let me try opening again. Okay, Michelle, let's try it again. If you can unmute. And if you'd like to now try speaking, if you are, we can't hear you still. All right, so Michelle, if you want to locate that Q&A icon, and Michelle dropped. Oh, there she is. Okay, she muted. Michelle, if you want to locate that Q&A icon on your screen and you could send us a message that way. She may be trying to reconnect. She dropped off the call, so we'll have to watch for her to come back.
Can we go on to Heather's comments?
Yes, I just wanted to suggest language for the Slipa supervision piece we were discussing earlier, with a proposal to change it to say, the supervisor shall provide immediate supervision of all duties performed by a speech language pathology assistant at least 20% per week of the Slipa's work schedule during the first 90 days of work following initial licensure.
Does that suggest that Slipas in other circumstances are not supervised then? To Holly's point?
Well, all the other requirements will still apply, that there are certain tasks that that require immediate supervision. There's other tasks that require indirect supervision. So all of those provisions will just apply. It's just a higher standard of supervision during the first 90 days.
I see. Okay. Karen? How about Holly?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I that's exactly what I was saying, is that is the nature of the job as an SLPA. You will always be supervised. So I think the language that you proposed, Heather, makes a lot of sense. I almost look at that 90 days as almost like for SLPs, your RPE. You do that, and once you're past that, then you are an SLP in all rights, in all forms. An SLPA, once they get through the first 90 days, then their job entails that they will always be supervised by an SLP, but they're not tied into the level of the 90, the first 90 days.
Okay.
So I think you said it well.
And this is the moderator. We have Michelle back. Would you like me to try her now?
Yes, please.
Michelle, you may unmute your line.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can.
Oh, wonderful. I'm sorry. I apologize. All of these solutions sound great. I think that where I find the biggest obstacle is that direct supervisor. Everyone gets a direct supervisor, right? But what happens then when that supervisor leaves, goes on maternity leave, or we're trying to hire someone and we have to hurry up and find an open license? And that's what I was speaking to, where I understand the need for supervision of a new clinician. And while it's hard to define a career SLPA, for example, just for lack of a better term, I mean, we could say, 5 years of uninterrupted work, that would, that would have been the equivalent if you were in a graduate program, or 4 years or whatever, that that is what you are going to continue doing, that we can have the flexibility of general supervision, the SLPs that are in the practice, versus having an assigned tethered person that it creates a relationship where there's a lot of instability for that employment. Or even if someone were to leave or do leave the Slipa without the supervision when we had to find somebody, I can't tell you how many times, we've had to stop everything and then redistribute caseloads. And again, when it goes back to the consistency of therapy, to consumer protection, to having people have their service be uninterrupted because someone decided to move or whatever their personal reason to not be at the practice, I think that is a real life situation that all of us encounter all the time in the practice, and so to employ someone and not even be able to guarantee their employment because someone might die or retire or leave or whatever, I find that if you're not hiring someone in good faith, and you're giving, you're talking to how do I say, it creates a huge impact, this dedicated person. So whether you allow, 8 part-timers, 6 part-timers, 3 full-timers, we're still always going to come into this issue with somebody that you employ.
And we do have another comment from Linda. Linda, I know you typed it into the comment section, but if you could actually speak it out loud, that way it's read into the record for the meeting.
Okay. The last one, that SLPAs are always supervised. This just clarifies that supervision during the first 90 days of a new SLPA. So helpful. Thank you so much.
Holly, did you want to add something?
I apologize. No, I don't.
So Heather, where are we here? Do we think that the existing language will cover what our concern was about seasoned versus new licensees?
I think that does provide clarification that it's only the one time when you first start your job right after being licensed.
Okay, and you said that was the last of the policy discussion issues that you wanted to talk about. Is there any other board concern or questions, comments? And no other public comment I see. So we make a motion to accept all of these changes in one motion, Paul?
Yes, I think we probably need to just go over it one last time, clarify it, or have the board make a motion to move forward with the changes and revisions that we've made today. Probably need to clarify what they are.
Okay, Heather, do you feel like you can go over the changes as you saw them today?
Yes, absolutely. So the first change appears on page 2, where we are removing subdivision J, the definition for qualifications deemed equivalent by the board. We are striking that entire language. The next change on page 3 in the subdivision D is going to be changed to read, notwithstanding subdivisions A, B, and C, the supervisor shall provide immediate supervision of all duties performed by a speech-language pathology assistant at least 20% per week of the Slipa's work schedule during the first 90 days of work following initial licensure. The lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring the Slipa meets the requirement in this subdivision. Then the next change appears on page 4 regarding the eligibility for approval of a Slipa program. In subdivision B, we are changing that to read, to be eligible for approval by the board, the program director must hold a current, active, and unrestricted California license, period. And we're getting rid of the language regarding qualifications deemed equivalent by the board. Then following that, on page, looks like we have a few pages. Page 11. On the bottom of the page, which is the subdivision 4, we are changing that to read, provide immediate supervision at least 20% per week of the Slipa's work schedule for the first 90 days following initial licensure. The lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring the Slipa meets the requirement in in subdivision, sorry, I have it kind of worded funny. The lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring the Slipa meets the requirements in this subdivision in section 1399.17.2D. And that's cross-referencing to the other change we made. Then the next change is on page 13 for the maximum number of support personnel. We are changing it to read, a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 full-time equivalent support personnel, not to exceed 6 support personnel at any time. Support personnel include speech-language pathology assistants and speech-language pathology aides. The next change is in 1399.170.17 on the same page. Following that first paragraph, we're adding at the end, the lead supervisor is responsible for ensuring the Slipa meets the requirement in section 1399.170D. And that's another cross-reference to that change we made. And then also on the same page in 1399.170.18, following the existing paragraph, we're adding the supervisor shall provide a copy of the form to the assistant within 45 business days. And that is all in the language on the form that's going to be incorporated by reference. On page 1, we are changing the reference to a clear credential document rather than a license document number. And then on page 3 of the form, item number 13, we are changing the statement to read, I will not supervise more than 3 full-time equivalent support personnel, not to exceed 6 support personnel at any time. Are there any questions about any of the changes or any additional information you need me to go over?
I have one question. Oh, I see Holly has her hand raised too.
Yeah, it was just that unless I'm mixed up about this, on item, on the form, item 11, it was 14 days for the copy to be given to the assistant. And wasn't that where you said 45? That's my question.
Yes, in the regulations, it does say in 45 days. So we can add that here as well.
So it's consistent. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. That's all.
Heather, I had a question. This is Paul. I want to make sure that we don't have to bring this back to the board. I'm sure you do too. Do we need to do we need to clearly define what full-time equivalent is? I think we were on track to do that. And we have a definition, I think, already, if I'm correct.
I think we didn't. It was kind of open-ended. Do we want to get involved in defining what employment is or leaving it discretion? We didn't really decide what we wanted to do.
I think in other areas we have said what a full-time equivalent is. I can actually, I'm not sure if it's in our regulations in another area, but that was just a question I wanted to throw out there.
And what is the will of the board? Do we want to define it and set an hour limit, or do we want to leave it as is?
Okay.
I suppose it doesn't hurt to say full-time, to define full-time equivalent.
And I just want to point out, if we are going to make a define full-time equivalent, we should do that in section 1399.170, where we have our definitions.
Okay. And you say you have a definition already?
I know we discussed the definition. I'm looking through our regulations right now, and I don't see a definition there. So if we're okay leaving it open-ended, and I would leave that, maybe take that question to Karen Halbo to see if that's something that we can do.
Karen Halbo?
Yeah, without it being defined, it's a clarity issue that the Office of Administrative Law will ask. What does this term mean? How do the regulated people know how to understand it?
Okay. And Gilda, did you want to add something?
Well, as I'm looking on the site under the RPE experience temporary license holders, it does state that full-time in parentheses at least 30 hours per week, and then it says the time frame 12 months or 15 months in a school setting, and then part-time parentheses 15 to 29 hours per week. So there is some verbiage on the website under the application questions.
So should we add to the language when we discuss full-time equivalents, that clarification? Part-time is up to 29 hours, full-time is 30 or more hours.
Karen, did you want to add something or speak to that? Karen Halbo?
Sorry, I thought I was muted. You can put it in a separate definition system, or you could also just have where you have full-time equivalent, comma, meaning employed at least 30 hours per week in the profession, comma, and then go on. Do you sort of mean you can clarify it right quick and dirty where you are, or you can put it in a separate definition section. And I don't know if you want to include having the part-time equivalent now, and if you do, then that would go in the definition section. You know, there's more than one way to skin a cat with regulations. And do you want to stick with what you've got on the website as the definition for both of those?
Well, it'd be nice to be consistent. That's true. Gilda, you wanted to say something more?
No, sorry about that.
It seems odd to me to put the full-time over in that section and the part-time definition under definitions. Seems like it might be cleaner to put them both under definitions.
That's totally fine. You get to decide. I don't know how much you're trying to get this one package out with a definition in it, or let's have it clarified for the whole section.
Any thoughts about that, Heather, that you see a preference for a consistency of having our definitions and then have them apply to the rest of the document, their usage in the rest of the document?
Personal preference is to put it in the definitions, just because I feel like when you're trying to define something within what the requirement is, it gets a little bit convoluted. But it's just personal preference. There's no right or wrong answer.
Any other thoughts about that? Opinions from board members or board staff? Okay, I'm good with putting it under definitions. I think that's consistent with the rest of the document. Anybody?
So we presented changes. Oh, pardon. We presented changes. I think now we just have to come up with that definition, and then we can entertain a motion.
That's correct. I'm just trying to get to that point. Are we okay with taking our definition and putting them under the definitions, or do we want to put it in the body of the document? And I think Heather and I had thought it might be more consistent or better suited under definitions, but I'm kind of waiting for anybody else who dissents on that.
Oh, I agree with that. Sorry.
Okay. All right, good. Gilda, thoughts?
I agree with putting it under definitions.
Okay. Anybody else who dissents on that? Okay, so I think that was the last issue before going forward with our motion to accept these changes. Paul, you had some suggested language for the motion, I think, in terms of moving forward. Do you want to repeat what you said? Or not?
I'm sorry.
Your mic went away.
Yeah. I think now we just need to discuss what the definition is. And I was wondering if Sharice or Heather had suggestions on how to define that.
I don't have a suggestion on the exact language, but in the definitions section on item subdivision I, we define support personnel. I think it would make sense to put in a new J for full-time equivalent.
Gilda?
So the website says full-time parentheses at least 30 hours per week, and then part-time parentheses 15 to 29 hours per week. That's verbatim.
Seems like we want to be consistent.
Oops.
Okay, so I will just repeat what the change is. In the definitions section under support personnel, we are going to add a new subdivision J that states full-time equivalent means at least 30 hours per week. Part-time is 15 to 29 hours per week.
Can I raise a point of clarification then? If we use the 15 to 29, does that mean that the SLP cannot hire somebody that only works 10 hours or one day for them for 8 hours? Because putting in that definition would, in my mind, preclude the others. So I don't know if I'm wrong, and maybe Karen Halbo would like to speak on like regulations and how they can inadvertently put a restriction there that maybe wasn't before, but defining full-time is one thing. Defining what part-time is with an hour range might say that you can't do any less than 15 hours.
I think you're correct, Charisse. It's one of those unintended consequences.
So we could change it to say part-time is 29 hours per week or less.
There you go.
Well, aren't we defining full-time? Shouldn't we just say what full-time equivalent is? Full-time equals 30 or more hours.
That is also the other option I was thinking of. Sorry I missed the earlier one when I ran down the hall. And as soon as I heard that, I said, oh, wait, I have heard of Slipas that work at one office for just one day, which would be the 8 hours. So,
No, good point.
So we could define full-time equivalent means at least 30 hours per week, period, and stay silent on what part-time is.
and I think that works because you still have said that there's a maximum of 6. So whether that part-time is 20 hours or 25 hours or 8 hours, you still get a max of 6.
Are all board members okay with that change and ready to move forward with a motion?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Can I make a comment first? This is Hilda.
Yes.
So there is a definition for per diem. If you want to throw another aspect into that, that's less than part-time. So if you want to include full-time, at least 30 hours per week, part-time 15 to 29 hours per week, you should also have the caveat of the per diem less than part-time. Could that be included in the FTE count?
I think at this point we're trying to clarify the regulation, which only refers to full-time equivalent. So the other definitions might not be necessary at this point.
And maybe those relate more to employment and those kind of categories rather than our concern of supervision.
So can I, if there's no further discussion by either the board members, oh, I do have Michelle has her hand up, a public member.
Michelle, we're not hearing you if you're speaking.
How about now?
We are now.
Okay. So I just wanted, in the definition of full-time, this has been something that is very hard to explain to people in reverse. 30 hours is full-time to get benefits, but it's a 40-hour position. I've had somebody come back to me and said, well, I only want to work 30 hours. And I'm like, well, it's a 40-hour position with everything combined that you do. And so I'm just concerned that the language in this is going to add more confusion to that. So if full-time could be up to 40 hours or 30 to 40 hours or some parameter there that allows full-time to be defined by not just over 30, because I think that in reverse, kind of how you were saying, if it's less, does that mean you couldn't hire somebody for less hours? Also in reverse, anybody going up to 40 hours in a 40-hour position, I think that's been a challenge in trying to explain to people what full-time is.
What if we said at least 30 hours?
That works. Something that gives us some flexibility for that. So if it says at least 30, they know it's 30 up to 40. That's what it's in a regular work week. Yeah, that could work very well.
Paul?
Yes, I agree with Michelle. I think this is a limiting statement, so I think we want to say up to 40 hours. If I'm thinking on this clearly, we've been looking at this for a long time. So, Charisse, from a licensing perspective, does that make sense? Full-time equivalent equals up to 40 hours?
Usually you want to tell me, well, I think knowing up to 40 hours is kind of a common sense language definition of full-time. So the question is there a cutoff from full-time to part-time? And that way staff knows what's clear. Lisa, do you have a concern? If there's, I would think there's a concern if there's not a, it starts at somewhere. Where does the line stand between full-time and part-time?
Karen, you have a thought
Yes,
on
I
that?
think it's better. Oh,
Sorry. Karen, how about, did you want to?
This is Lisa. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm
Do you want to
sorry.
go ahead, Karen?
Karen had her hand up, but go ahead, Lisa.
Okay. I was just going to respond to Cherise. Yeah, the better we define it, the easier it is to both explain to supervisors and Slipas who are calling in to ask questions, and also when we're reviewing to see how many Slipas a supervisor can have underneath them. We need to be able to define how many we can assign to them and so we would need a definition of how many hours constitutes part-time versus how many constitutes full-time.
Karen, how about, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Was there a desire to have the full-time equivalent definition be at least 30 and up to 40 hours so that you have a range? Because it seemed like somehow you needed that cap on the 40 end to be there. And it sounds like it would be useful to define part-time, but then you have the per diem too, and where that fits in, it doesn't seem to be a part of this regulation. But the board is having really useful discussion on this. It won't be hard to explain why the choices were made.
Do people work more than 40 hours?
This is the moderator. We have another comment from Michelle. Did you want me to unmute her mic?
Yeah, I was trying to get board before I went to her, but
okay.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you. I just wanted to not make it worse. I know we're talking about full-time, so up to 40, but we do have people that are part-time, 29 and below. There's half-time below 20. There is per diem. We have had situations where we needed temporary coverage for 2 weeks. It would have been helpful to be able to bring in an SLPA in the middle of a break that wanted to pick up some hours for 2 weeks. That's considered seasonal if you were able to do that, if it's a temporary hire, somebody that's familiar with the practice, for example. Somebody asked if somebody works more than 40 hours. I mean, I don't know how, but they do. Some do. They work in different settings, different places. I'm more familiar with SLPs that do that versus like an SLPA. But in terms of coverage, those are all different types of employment that you might offer. And so if we're defining just full-time, but not anything else, I mean, are we going to need to be able to have something a document or some opinion that says this is what these things are considered or determined to be? Because again, it causes confusion. I know some of that should be common sense, but I can't tell you how the new workforce really doesn't understand some of these employment definitions, job descriptions. They don't always understand compensation. It's become more and more of an issue where they're unaware of what it is. And so we spend a lot of time trying to train that. And so I would hate for there to be a document that kind of adds more confusion to it. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Cherise. Looks like she took her hand down. Paul?
Sorry, I think there might be a point at which we can't fix all employment issues for everyone, but we do need to be able to determine how many Slipas can be on a license and what's full-time versus anything else, and how to distribute that. So if it's 3 full-timers, great, that's super simple. But if they have 1 full-timer and that leaves them 2 slots open, this might go back to making it even easier for some, but then that doesn't help with employment issues. But that's potentially outside our purview, that 1 full-time equivalent equals 2 part-time equivalent, and then or 2 non-full-time support personnel. I'm struggling on what would be the cleanest option so that we can implement it, because it's got to be clear for us to implement, but understanding also that we may not be able to fix all these employment or how people understand different levels and pay and stuff that's more on the labor side than us.
Okay, I agree with that sentiment. Paul?
Yes, I have a suggestion. So if I'm trying to determine how many Slipas I can have, and I know it's three full-time equivalents, I need to know up to how many I can have, which would be 30. I was going to say full-time equivalent is defined for the purposes of this section, or however we word that. Full-time equivalent is defined as 30 to 40 hours. 30 to 40 hours during the work week, or however we word it on that section. Let's see. 30 to 40 hours per week.
And not define part-time?
Because then it would be implied that anything below that is part-time.
Okay. I think that's probably the cleanest thing to do. Charisse?
I think, again, we might just try to clarify that we are defining full-time equivalent, and anything under that is that it meets up to the 6 cap. So whether it's part-time or per diem is not up to us, but you get a max of 6. 6 that aren't full-time. So it's 3 full-time or up to 6 in whatever other arrangement, per diem, part-time, whatever you're using for employment purposes. For our purposes, it's 3 full-time or up to 6.
Right, and that's the language that Heather presented. So following that language, we would say what full-time equivalent is, right? Or in a different section, as Heather stated earlier.
We're talking about putting this in the definitions following support personnel, a new division J, which would read, for the purpose of this division, full-time equivalent means 30 to 40 hours per week.
And do we need to spell out 40 hours, or can it be 30 hours or a minimum of 30 hours or more?
I think what we don't want to happen is someone working someone 50 to 60 hours and saying, oh, they're my full-time person.
But is that outside of our purview?
Well, I think we're trying to limit it, though. If we don't say that, then you could have 6 people working 30 hours a week, or 30. If we don't have a limit, that's why I think we have to cap it.
Well, the limit's 33 full-time. So if they're at 30 or up, you only get 3.
That's right. Heather, was that the language you already had for J, for the new J?
Yeah, I added Paul's suggestion for purposes of this division, because then that's saying it only applies to this part of the regulations. It's not like we're defining full-time equivalent for the entire universe.
Okay, are we feeling comfortable with the definitions and language that we have so far? Anybody not comfortable with it or have a comment? Whether board member or public member? Okay, hearing none, seeing none. I think we're ready for a motion to accept these additional changes to the proposed regulatory language for the Slipa regulations. Would somebody like to make that motion? Or
I can
do we
read.
have it?
I can read what the motion will be if you would like.
That would be helpful.
Okay. The board moves to approve the regulatory language and responsibility statement form to be incorporated by reference with the discussed changes. Delegate authority to the executive officer to make any technical and non-substantive changes and move to start the formal rulemaking process.
So move.
Second?
That was Debbie Snow.
Yes.
Okay, Sharice, you want to call the vote?
Madam Chair, we will need public comment on the motion. This is Mike.
Okay.
There you go.
This is the moderator. Our Q&A panel is still open. If you'd like to make one final comment regarding the proposed motion, please click on that Q&A icon on your screen, type comment into the text field, and submit that to our panelists, or you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon that appears next to your name. And seeing none, would you like me to close the panel?
Yes, thank you.
It is closed.
Is there any further board discussion? Here's not. Can we call the vote now?
Yes. Dr. Raggio,
Aye.
Ms. Kaiser,
Aye.
Mr. Borges,
Aye.
Ms. Chang,
Aye.
Ms. Dominguez,
Aye.
Ms. Snow,
Aye.
and the motion carries.
Would anybody like a short break at this point?
Aye.
Aye.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
5 minutes.
Would 10 minutes be enough?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so back at 3:43, or how about 3:45? Back, everybody. We have a couple more items to get through today. So I'd like to move ahead to agenda item 15, legislative report, update, review, and possible action on proposed legislation. Again, Heather Oliveros is going to give us this update. Heather, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the priority bills for the board. There are a number of watch bills also included in this report, and I just want to point out a few of them that are new. AB 457, AB 468, AB 1221, and AB 1308. I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the watch bills at the end of this report, but I will just be covering the priority ones. The first section of your report is the 2021 legislative calendar and upcoming deadlines. August 16th, the legislature will be coming back from the summer recess that they're currently on. And when they return, they will have until August 27th for the fiscal committees to meet and report bills in the second house. And then the last day for each house to pass bills is on September 10th. And then any bill passed by September 10th, the governor will have until October 10th to sign or veto the bills. As a reminder, the board has a sponsored bill, which is AB 435 regarding locked hearing aids. This bill is currently on the Senate floor. It has not received any formal opposition at this point, so we anticipate that this bill will pass in the Senate upon the return from summer recess, and then will go to the governor for signature. As a reminder, this bill would require hearing aid dispensers and dispensing audiologists to provide a purchaser with a written notice if the hearing aid being purchased uses proprietary or locked programming software. The written notice would need to be signed by the purchaser, and the licensee would be required to retain a copy consistent with the current record retention requirements. Following that, on page 2 of your report, the board has a position on a number of legislation, so I will just provide an update on those bills. AB 29, which the board has an approved opposed position on, this is a 2-year bill. It was held under submission in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. This bill would require the board to make all writings and materials for publicly noticed meetings available on the board's website and provide to any person requesting such materials in writing at least 72 hours prior to the meeting, or on the same day the writings and materials are provided to board members, whichever is earlier. This bill would also prohibit the board from discussing or acting on any items not provided in advance of the meeting as required. The next bill, AB 107, the board has an approved oppose unless amended position. This bill is scheduled for hearing on August 16th in the Senate Appropriations Committee. This bill would require boards to issue a temporary license within 30 days to applicants currently licensed in another state who are married to or in a domestic partnership with an active duty member of the military currently stationed in California. If the criminal background check does not show grounds for denial, the temporary license would expire 12 months after issuance, or upon issuance of a permanent license, whichever occurs first, and this bill would remove current provisions that allow a temporary license to expire upon the denial of an application. Additionally, this bill would require the board to track application and licensing statistics for military personnel and spouses and post specified information on the board's website. The next bill is AB 225. The board has an approved oppose unless amended position. This is a 2-year bill. It will not be moving forward this year because it was not heard in the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee. This bill would expand current law regarding requiring a temporary license for applicants currently licensed in another state who are married to or in a domestic partnership with an active duty member of the military currently stationed in California to also apply to applicants who are veterans discharged within the previous 5 years and active duty military personnel who will be separating for the military within 90 days. Additionally, this bill would remove current provisions that allow a temporary license to expire upon the denial of an application. The next bill is AB 555, and the board has an approved oppose unless amended position. This is also a 2-year bill because it was not heard in the Assembly Education Committee. This bill would authorize a local education agency or special education local plan area to retain, sell, or dispose of an assistive technology device, including hearing aids, if the market value of the device is less than $5,000 and it is not needed for another individual with exceptional needs. The next bill is AB 555. The board has an approved support position. This is a 2-year bill, which was not heard in the Assembly Governmental Organization Committee. This bill would amend current law regarding public meetings held by teleconference to only require the agenda to include a primary physical meeting location where the public may physically attend and participate. Board members attending the meeting via teleconference or physically at the primary physical location would count toward establishing a quorum, and this bill would require public meetings held by teleconference to include both an audible and visual means of participation. The next bill is AB 1026. The board has an approved support position. This is also a 2-year bill that was held under submission in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. This bill would require boards to grant a 50% fee reduction for an initial license for military veterans who provide satisfactory evidence with their application, and defines what that means. The next one is AB 1361. The board has an approved oppose unless amended position. This is also a 2-year bill that was held under submission in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. And this bill would require specific actions to be taken prior to disenrolling or suspending a child due to a behavior issue, and would require the use of suspension or expulsion only as a last resort in responding to a child's behavior. This includes a provision that would authorize a person with at least a master's degree in speech and language pathology to provide early childhood mental health consultation services. And the last bill is SB 772, which the board has an approved opposed position. This is also a 2-year bill. It was not heard in the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee. And this bill would prohibit the assessment of an administrative fine for minor violations if the licensee corrects the violation within 30 days. Minor violations would be defined as those that do not pose a serious health or safety threat, are not willful, do not occur while on probation, and are not violations that the licensee has a history of committing. So at this time, I am not recommending any changes to any of the board's positions or adopting any new positions. So I am happy to take any questions or any comments from board members and the public.
This is the moderator. We've opened the Q&A panel. If you'd like to make a comment on this item, please click on the Q&A icon on your screen, type comment into the text field, and submit that to our panelists, or you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon next to your name. And seeing no requests from the public, I'll close the panel.
I noticed Dr. Raggio's mic is muted.
That's correct.
Okay, there we go.
So Heather, it looks like we don't have any board comment or public comment so far. Do you want to move on to the watch bills?
Well, I wasn't planning to go over them since we're not recommending to take a position on any of them, but if anyone has a question on any of them, I can answer that. But in the interest of time, I didn't want to go over them since we're not recommending any position changes.
Okay. Are there any questions about the bills that are in the watch status? by the board? Seeing none, shall we ask the public if they have any comments or questions regarding the bills with a watch status?
And this is the moderator. I've again opened the Q&A panel. If you have a comment or question on the bills that have a watch status on the agenda, please click on that Q&A icon and submit the word comment, or click on the hand icon next to your name. And again, seeing none, I will close the panel.
Okay. Thank you, Heather, for those for that information for us. I'd like to move on to agenda item number 16, legislative items for future meetings. So I'd like to solicit any thoughts on legislative items from either board members or board staff at this point.
Board staff did not have any additional items, but if any board members do, or the public, we are happy to take a look at them for a future meeting.
Okay, I'm not seeing any board questions. Can we open it up for public comment?
This is the moderator. We've again opened the Q&A panel. If you'd like to make a comment on this item, please click on the Q&A icon on your screen, submit comment to all panelists, or click on the hand icon next to your name. And seeing none, I'll close the panel.
Thank you. So if there's no further discussion on this item, I'd like to move to our last item before we go into closed session, and that is future agenda items. Would anybody like to offer those? Todd?
Thank you. One thing I brought up at the last board meeting that I thought might be on this one was the desire to look at the continuing ed hours for the hearing aid dispensers. We talked about the speech and language and audiologists this board meeting concerning the hours related to live versus recorded. And as I stated at the last board meeting, that's something I wanted to take a look at for hearing aid dispensers, given the lack of options that dispensers have for live hours that are available throughout the year. Is that something we can, now I know Paul mentioned that we don't have a quorum on that particular committee, so I wasn't sure if that meant we couldn't discuss it until we have a quorum. Having just been made the chair of that committee, I don't really know if there's something I needed to submit or something to do to make that happen, but I would just like to put that out there.
Hi, this is Paul. We can definitely list that as a future agenda item, and then we can work out the details of the quorum, and who knows what we'll have at that point. We may have an appointment by then.
Don't tease me.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other suggestions for future agenda items? Seeing none from other board members, I'd like to open this up to the public to see if there are any future agenda items that they would like to discuss.
We've opened the Q&A panel. If you'd like to submit a recommendation for future agenda items, please click on the Q&A icon on your screen, type comment into the text box, and submit that to our panelists. You may also click on the raise hand icon next to your name to raise your hand. And seeing none, I will close the panel.
Thank you. Okay, at this point, the board will go into closed session. I'd like to tell any individuals who are not direct members of the board that we will be adjourning after this closed session, so there'll be no further business today. I see that Michelle has her hand up. Before we go, we should see what she has to say.
I just wanted to say thank you for today and yesterday, the discussion. All of it has been so robust and wonderful. And I can't tell you how much we all appreciate everything that all of you do. Thank you for listening to me. And I look forward to sitting in on other meetings. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We really appreciate your input. It's vital to the board, so we appreciate it.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. So if there are no other comments, I would like to go into closed session and ask anybody who's not pertinent to the board here to drop off the call.